Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well and that you're fighting fit and in good form, and I hope you're going to get yourself something lovely to drink, because it's always good to have something lovely and soothing as the days get colder. Some hot chocolate perhaps, and relax, because you're going to listen to a fabulous story tonight, and it's a lovely story. So before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I sat nervously anchored to the pew in the front row of the church, where a congregation of people had gathered together. There were many folk from our small rural town. They'd come to bid a fond farewell to my great-aunt Betsy. I was seated to the left of my husband Barlow. I knew he was not remotely happy to be at this funeral with me. He had made it poignantly clear that my great-aunt Betsy's death had been nothing more than an annoying inconvenience. He'd rather be out there on the green playing golf with one of his friends than sitting at my side holding my hand at a funeral. It would seem bidding my great-aunt Betsy farewell was the last thing my husband Barlow was desirous to do, given he'd never liked great-aunt Betsy very much. She had in turn openly made no secret of the fact that she despised him. She had told me her opinions of Barlow unhesitantly, insisting that I was an utter fool to marry the man. "Open your eyes, Rose dear," she had told me. "That man will make you an absolute laughing-stock in town. I know the type all too well. He's like a chameleon, and those men are the very worst. They adapt to their surroundings and become what you want them to be when they're around you. But the reality is you never really know what they're truly like, what they're getting up to behind your back. You need to watch Barlow, my dear, like a hawk. He can't be trusted. Remember, he didn't exactly have a good reputation. He had a reputation of being a player, and what I always say, once a player, always a player." "Aunt Betsy," I had said, "my husband used to be a player, but he's not like that anymore, I promise. After we got together, he never ever looked at another woman." Great-aunt Betsy rolled her eyes at me, as if she thought I was decidedly naive. "Does a leopard ever change his spots, Rose dear? I don't think so. I'm a lot older than you. I'm more wary of the world we live in now. I've seen things in my lifetime that would make your hair curl. I'm sorry to say, but Barlow needs watching, and if that man dares to hurt you, I'll kill him myself, and I'm not joking either." I thought great-aunt Betsy's bemoaning of my husband Barlow were just the ramblings of an old lady who somehow had never warmed to Barlow. She had probably decided that he was a prize cad, so therefore was expressing her extreme disapproval of him to me. But did it mean that her seemingly biased assessment of him had been correct? Had I got my husband Barlow horribly wrong over these years? I sincerely hope not, but a tiny little voice in my head for a long time that I refused to acknowledge had told me otherwise. But when you're in denial, you refuse to admit what is staring you directly in the face. My great-aunt Betsy had big opinions on things, but that was part of her nature. So I took what she said about Barlow with a pinch of salt, almost as if it was water off a duck's back. My mother had assured me resolutely that if I loved Barlow, that was all that mattered in the grand scheme of things. Even if great-aunt Betsy strongly disapproved of him, she always described Barlow as a wolf in sheep's clothing, on multiple occasions. It upset me, because I so wanted great-aunt Betsy to like Barlow. I really wanted her to warm to him, but to convince her that he was actually an incredibly nice man was rather like leading a horse to water and trying to make it drink. I knew it would never happen, and I'd been absolutely right about that. My husband Barlow's capricious behaviour that morning, when we'd been preparing ourselves for great-aunt Betsy's funeral, that we were about to attend at the local church, run by Pastor George Ferris, had been at the very best rather disingenuous. I didn't like the way he ranted on and on about Aunt Betsy, with such an unkind rhetoric, when she wasn't even cold in her grave yet. How could he be so cruel, especially when he knew I loved her so much? He continued to complain bitterly that he had to accompany me to church for the funeral, which was the last thing he wanted to do, even though I was glad to see he was reluctantly getting dressed in his swish dark suit and shining shoes befitting for a funeral, even though he was making a big song and dance about it. Nevertheless, his indignance was making an angry bubble well up inside me. I couldn't help but think that he'd become like an insolent, pouting teenager who'd been told by his mother that he had to do his homework rather than ride his dirt bike over the countryside, and as a consequence was having a good old sulk about it. Let's just say that Barlow was going through the motions of making it poignantly clear that he felt he was being bamboozled into going to Great Aunt Betsy's funeral against his will. Barlow was my husband, for goodness sake. Great Aunt Betsy was my mother's sister, and as far as I was concerned, my husband had a duty of responsibility to accompany me to her funeral, whether he liked it or not, as that's what you do as a family member. But he refused to see it like that. It was like he thought he was doing me a great big favour by agreeing to come to the funeral at all. "I was going to play golf today," he told me. "Then that bloody great aunt of yours had to ruin everything for me by popping her clogs at the most inopportune time. It's so typical of the woman. Even in death she really knows how to pick her moments, doesn't she? I'll have you know, I'm incredibly pissed about this. I planned this golf game with Larry O'Brien over a month ago. We are old friends that go back a long time, and I was looking forward to hanging out with him for a change. But as usual, that hag is successfully rubbing me up the wrong way, even though she's barely cold in her grave yet." He made an exaggerated sigh to express his extreme indignance. It was an expression he employed when he was doing something incredibly unwillingly, as a big, big favour to me, as if in some way I was supposed to be so grateful for his so-called sacrifices. "My bet is the stupid woman is still going to haunt me in the afterlife, to make my life incredibly miserable. I wouldn't put anything past the old bat. She never liked me, did she?" "You're disgusting, Barley. I can't believe you're talking about Great Aunt Betsy like this. You should be ashamed of yourself. Have you got no respect for the dead? This is my mother's sister we're talking about, and whether you like it or not, you need to accompany me to the funeral to show your support. Great Aunt Betsy never chose for this to happen to her, did she? Her unforeseen death was tragic, and it affected us all. We're all dismayed about it. I can't even imagine for the life of me what that poor woman must have gone through in the very last moments of her death. I dread to even think about it. I can only hope, with all my heart, that death came quickly to her, so she didn't suffer. No one could have ever predicted this happening, and all you can do is whinge, Barley. Poor old me! I have to go to the funeral. I wanted to play golf today, and now I can't go. I wanted to see Larry O'Brien. You're being really—" I paused for a brief moment to look for the exact word I was looking for to describe my husband's abysmally detached behaviour. "You're being self-centred, selfish, narcissistic, and incredibly unkind about poor Great Aunt Betsy. And besides anything else, very unsympathetic towards me and my mother. Don't you even care for a second that Aunt Betsy's death has been very, very distressing for us all, traumatising, most especially the bizarre, outlandish manner in which she died. And all you can think about is yourself and this pathetic game of golf you're missing out on. Do you have any idea how childishly pathetic you sound? You should be ashamed of yourself for being so emotionally aloof, so indifferent, so insouciant. It's sickening, really sickening. You're supposed to be my husband, Barley, but where is your support towards me and my mother? I can't see it anywhere. I can't imagine other people's husbands behaving like you are now, over a family member's funeral." "Don't compare me with other people, Rose. That's not fair, and you know it. I never liked the old biddy, so why should I have to go to her funeral?" said Barlow contemptuously, his thin lips turning into an upside-down smile. And when I looked at him for a fleeting moment, I wondered how I'd ever found the man, even remotely attractive, when I'd married him all but 10 years ago. When I look back on my whimsical naivety, I wonder how I could have been so foolish. They say men are easily seduced by a pretty face, and they get a lot of rap for it, don't they? You hear of a man marrying a model, and then bitterly complaining that his life is a living hell with the woman he married, because he soon learns that she's a prize cow, henpecking him the whole time, and making his life insufferably intolerable. People shake their heads and say, "He was an absolute fool for being so enticed by a pretty face. As far as I'm concerned, he gets exactly what he deserved." You could say I was no better than such an easily seduced man, whose only crime was to fall for a pretty face. Let's just say I was no better than that. I fell for Barlow's debonair handsomeness from the moment I first laid eyes on him, but never for a minute would I imagine he would have been interested in the likes of little old me. All the girls in town had fancied Barlow, with his roguishly wild blonde hair that fell in a tumble of curls that cascaded around an almost perfect symmetrical face. And then, of course, there were those piercing blue eyes that made many of the girls buckle at their knees, describing him as utterly gorgeous, and his body so perfectly chiselled, like a fine statue that a skilled sculptor made as close to perfection as you could possibly get. Everything about my husband Barlow had been physically perfect, and the trouble was, he knew it. He could have been in the front cover of a male magazine, if he'd really wanted to be. So when he'd shown interest in little plain old me, I had been more than a little surprised and bewildered, but at the same time extremely delighted and very flattered. It had been wonderful being the object of his undivided attention, and I suppose you could say I was completely swept off my feet by the man. I had never been a cheerleader at school, or the kind of girl that drew men in because of my so-called drop-dead gorgeous looks. I was simply like the very ordinary, rather nondescript girl living next door, carrying a few extra pounds, always a little on the dumpy side. And let's just say I don't think any modelling agencies would exactly be breaking down their doors to get me to model their designer creations in a hurry, unless I lost a significant amount of weight, of course. And even if I did meet their exacting stick-thin requirements, I guess they would consider me not glamorous enough and far too plain to brace one of their glossy covers, even with all the airbrushing in the world that they rigorously employ, to make all the women in our society feel helplessly insecure, measuring up to an insane standard that does not exist at all. I couldn't even fathom what Barlow had seen in me, given he could have practically had any girl in town that he'd wanted. And for a long time he did have a reputation as quite the player. I will admit that. But he had given me his solemn word that he wasn't like that any more. And silly old me, I believed him. I bought every word of it. Ostensibly in a small town, people talk a lot, don't they? And I wouldn't be surprised if Great-Aunt Betsy had heard some of those rumours about my husband's past and his amorous reputation. So was it any surprise that she'd never really liked him? I suppose not. I'm sure a lot of the very pretty local girls in town were wondering when I started dating Barlow what on earth he saw in me, with my unremarkable, wild, mousy brown hair and slightly off-centre nose scattered with a plethora of freckles. But no one wondered about that more than I did. I genuinely felt like the lucky girl that snagged the golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But we all know the unfortunate fate of many of those golden ticket holders in the story, and that didn't end well for many of them. If the truth be told, when I really stopped to think about things long and hard, I realised that my husband Barlow had never much supported me during the entire course of our marriage over anything, and I wasn't sure why this was the case. I always put it down to him being an extremely busy man, as he was hardly ever at home these days, due to his entrepreneurial business that he had started, that seemed to demand his undivided attention. I naively had trusted Barlow implicitly, never even for a second concerning myself that he could be double-crossing me behind my back. It was his surly attitude on this very sombre morning towards Great-Aunt Betsy's death that seemed to awaken something inside me, as I began soulfully reflecting on many of the things that Great-Aunt Betsy had spouted to me about Barlow, that at the time I'd shaken off rather like the loose hairs on a cat's coat, and paid them little heed. But now, as I was re-evaluating her opinion on my husband, and wondering if she'd been right about him all along, why was I even thinking these thoughts, I wondered? Why was I even entertaining them? I was mad at him for being so obnoxious this morning, about not wanting to attend the funeral. But Barlow of late had been getting under my skin, for quite some time actually, and now these feelings of bitter disappointment and regret seemed to be rearing their ugly heads and demanding my swift attention. I hate to tell you this, Rose, but your husband Barlow only cares about Barlow, Aunt Betsy had said to me. If a man marries a woman, he should be willing to take a bullet for her. Do you think, Rose dear, that Barlow would sacrifice himself on your behalf? Never, not even for a second do I think that. That man would never lay down anything for you, let alone his life. As I thought about Great Aunt Betsy's words, a cold shiver crawled down my spine. If Barlow wasn't willing to sacrifice a game of golf to attend Great Aunt Betsy's funeral on my account, as a token of support for me, if push came to shove, would he give up his life for me? I took in a deep breath. As I think deep down inside me, I knew the answer to the question. No, Barlow would never take a bullet for me. Never. He'd only be interested in preserving himself. Had Great Aunt Betsy been right about him all along? Had I been so blindsided by his beguiling charms that I'd failed to see him for who he really was? It would seem so, but right now I just didn't want to engage in this manner of disconcerted thinking. I was grievously upset already, and besides we had a funeral to go to, after I had managed to drill some sense into my husband Barlow, who finally agreed to come to the funeral, ever so begrudgingly, of course. I couldn't help but think, what would the townsfolk think if he was not at my side, like the dutiful, devoted husband he pretended to be? Great Aunt Betsy was quite the character. She was a larger-than-life personality. She never cared what anybody thought about her. She was out there with her opinions. She was as honest and as straightforward as a child. She said it like it was. There were people that hated her for it, of course, but many loved her because of how unabashedly, refreshingly candid she was, which is a rare quality to have these days. So many people are concerned about political correctness. They're worried about expressing their true opinion, lest that opinion should cause offence. I knew I was rather like that, actually, a lot like that, if I'm being brutally honest. I did care very much about people's opinions. And where had that got me in my life? Absolutely nowhere. In truth, it had turned me into a pathetic people-pleaser. I hated that part of myself. And those who knew me probably thought it was a weakness in my character. And they would be right about that. Great Aunt Betsy did not care about any of that. Maybe I could do with learning a thing or two from her sagaciously independent attitude. "You're too soft on the inside, Rose dear," Great Aunt Betsy would tell me from time to time. "You care far too much about what other people think of you. And you'll be surprised how little they do think of you. You shouldn't be worrying about other people's opinions. You should only be your true authentic self. You need to grow a pair, Rose, and learn to be what God intended you to be. And that is being true to yourself." Great Aunt Betsy had been absolutely right, but I'd never known her to be wrong about anything. I looked up at my husband. He was putting on a black tie over his white shirt. He wasn't looking best pleased about it all. He was scowling, looking incredibly disagreeable. How I hated it when he acted out like this. "You're my husband, Barlow, in case you've forgotten," I chortled angrily. "The very least you can do is show some support to me and my mother today. We need you. My mother is devastated about Great Aunt Betsy's death. You've treated her with nothing but contempt. Can't you see she's a broken woman? She's rarely hurting. She's been staying with us for over a week now, as I don't like her being left in her house. And you haven't been remotely welcoming towards her. You've made it poignantly clear you don't like having her around, which is downright rude. You have had zero sympathy towards her. Losing Great Aunt Betsy has hit us both hard. And you don't seem to care a jot about our feelings on the matter. All you care about is your stupid golf, and you make me sick. Are we going to go on and on about this again and again and again, like a broken record? And if you want to know about your mother, she's the one that's being pathetic, not me, my husband interjected defensively. You're as blind as a bat, Rose. I might suggest you try and open them. That woman is so bloody needy. She's big enough and ugly enough to look after herself, but she plays straight into your hands every single time, does she not? You had to insist that she moved in with us for a while. And if you want to know, it's true. I don't remotely enjoy her hanging around our house like a bad smell. Everywhere I go, there she is, standing in my pathway. Every time I want to do something, there she is. I want to go to the kitchen to get some milk out of the refrigerator. And what do I find? Your mother, sitting at the kitchen table, looking like a lost kitten that is looking for a new home. When I want to go into the living room to get a drink, there she is again, sitting on the couch, staring into space. I'm telling you, Rose, if you make her too comfortable living here with us, that woman will never leave. Your mother can't cook like you can. When she stays with us, what does she get? First-class service, fluffy towels, clean clothes, and all the a la carte food she can ever dream of, presented to her, as if she's in a 5-star hotel. You treat your mother like a celebrity. If I was her, I also would not want to leave. Your great-aunt Betsy's dead, and your mother's acting like it's the end of the world. My heart bleeds for her, he said sarcastically, making the bile rise up in the back of my throat. Because, Barlow, for your information, it is the end of the world for my mother. Can't you see that? Or are you blind as well as callous? Need I remind you, great-aunt Betsy was my mother's only living connection to her late mother, and now it's been taken away from her. Of course she's upset. Show some compassion, will you? I'm glad she's staying with us. She needs my support. And yes, I want to pamper her and make her feel good, as if she's in a 5-star hotel. And what's wrong with that? She can't be alone during this tumultuous time. And besides anything else, she's not taking advantage of us, Barlow. She needs me right now. You think I should show compassion to your mother, do you? Feel sorry for her because of your great-aunt Betsy's death? Need I remind you that your great-aunt Betsy never had a single nice word to say about me during the course of our entire marriage? It was clear she never liked me. Do you know what she said to me on our wedding day? I never told you this. I didn't want to upset you. But she actually offered me money to break off my relationship with you and abandon you at the altar. Can you believe that? She asked me to name my price. Of course, I didn't believe a word of it. Your Aunt Betsy didn't have a brass farthing to rub together, did she? I remember she marched up to me furiously and said, "You're not good enough for Rose, Barlow. You hear that? You'll never be good enough for my Rose. I know what your type is like. You're slippery. You can't be trusted. I just want you to know that if you so much as hurt her, I will come around to wring your neck myself. You think a fox does damage when he goes into a chicken coop and kills all the chickens? Well, you ain't seen anything yet. Do you hear that, young man? Name your price, Barlow, and I will write you a substantially large cheque. But break off with Rose, I am begging you. I am begging you from the bottom of my heart. I know you're going to hurt her, and it's beyond anything I can bear to see Rose hurt. But if you hurt her, you are going to be sorry, my friend, and I can promise you that." My face drained of colour. "Great-aunt Betsy was going to pay you not to marry me?" I asked, looking confounded. "She'd have had to remortgage her house to give you a substantial payout." Was I surprised when I really stopped to think about this? Of course I wasn't. This was the kind of thing Aunt Betsy would do if she had strong opinions about something. One thing was for sure, she never liked Barlow. "I wonder if you'd have accepted it if Aunt Betsy had had millions of dollars in the bank," I suddenly said, Could Great Aunt Betsy have paid you off, I wonder? Had she been stinking rich? Now there's a thought, I said, studying my husband intently, to gauge his reaction. Barlow flushed. His skin became quite pink. Did that mean he could have been bribed not to marry me by Great Aunt Betsy, had she been wealthy enough to pay him off? He avoided my inquiring gaze and said, "Of course not. Don't be silly. You know your Great Aunt Betsy couldn't have offered me even a gold mine, and I still wouldn't have accepted her offer. You're the love of my life, aren't you?" He parroted the words, with very little conviction, as if he was reciting a song from a hymn book. "I sincerely hope you mean that, Barlow. I really do. You say you love me, but I'm sorry you've got a funny way of showing it. You haven't exactly shown me any support today." "Of course I mean it. You know I love you." "I know Great Aunt Betsy never liked you, and I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry you had a personality conflict. But you know what Great Aunt Betsy was like. She always spoke her mind. But you must realise this funeral is not just about Great Aunt Betsy's death. It's about us as a family. We always need to show support for each other during a chaotic time such as this. I understand your feelings for Great Aunt Betsy, but you need to put them aside. You really do. You need to be here for me and my mother. Many people are grieving her death. Lots of the townsfolk are. Even though she was forthright and very opinionated, and if she didn't like you, you knew about it, she was loved by so many people, and there are many people in town seriously devastated about her loss. I want you to remember that, Barlow. This funeral is not just about you. It's about showing support to the whole community, to all the people that are grieving Great Aunt Betsy's loss." "Did I say I wasn't coming with you? Look at me, I'm all dressed up for the funeral, am I not? I just said it was a damn shame, that's all, that I'm missing out on my game of golf with my good friend Larry O'Brien. I haven't seen the man for a long while. And as I said, I was looking forward to catching up with him. Well, his news, I mean. I wouldn't be putting on this suit and tie if I wasn't coming with you, so you can't say I'm not a supportive husband." "Well, I appreciate your support, Barlow, I really do. But can we agree not to say anything negative about Great Aunt Betsy? This is her funeral. It's not good to speak ill of the dead." "My lips are sealed. I won't say another word." At the church, my mother was seated to my right in the pew. She was desperately trying to keep her tears at bay, with very little success, I might add. I knew she didn't want any of the locals to see how distressed and devastated she was in losing Great Aunt Betsy, but anyone, even glancing at her briefly, could see that she was barely managing to hold it together. Her lack of composure seemed to be decidedly annoying to my husband, who kept glancing at her disapprovingly and frowning, as if he found her to be a frustrating fly, buzzing around the church pew that he seriously wanted to swat away. He rolled his exasperated eyes at me. I could understand, by his body language, exactly what he was saying, without any words. "Look what I have to put up with. Your mother making a right old spectacle of herself in front of all the locals. Hasn't she at least got the dignity to hold herself together, just for the funeral?" My mother was sniffling and blowing her nose so incredibly loudly that the whole pew began to shake under the vibration. For a small, demure woman, she certainly could pack a punch when she blew that nose of hers. Her puffy eyes had been framed by red rings that not even the skillful make-up I'd recently applied was capable of concealing. She was looking lugubriously sorrowful. It really tugged at my heartstrings to see my mother in such a dreadful, discomposed and fragile state. But there was nothing I seemed to be able to do to comfort her. It was like her whole world had fallen apart, like an egg that's just cracked open, and you can never put it back together again. I had helped my mother get dressed that morning. She seemed physically incompetent and incapable of managing to help herself. She was barely functioning like a normal human being, for that is what grief can sometimes do to you. It was as if my mother had morphed into a little girl, totally dependent on her own mother to dress her and to feed her. It was almost like our roles had been reversed. My mother seemed so helpless, and I had felt a desperate need to protect her rather like a fledgling that you find on the sidewalk that's been mauled by the cat, and you're doing your level best to take care of it, but wonder all the time if that little fledgling will manage to pull through, because in such a sorry, bedraggled state, it looks as if the odds are impossibly stacked against it. My mother was like that fledgling, so broken up, so desperately lost, and I was seriously worried that her grief would finally tear her apart. My mother sniffled. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Rose dear, without your great-aunt Betsy around," my mother had wailed, a couple of hours before we'd left for the church. "Do you know she was misunderstood by so many people? She just wasn't afraid to speak her mind. I just can't understand how any of this could have happened to her. Such a good woman she was. Not a nasty bone in her body. Such an honourable citizen. It's just not fair. It's just not fair. Sometimes I wonder if there is even a God." "I know, Mum," I had said encouragingly. "Life isn't always fair. Things happen in this world. Sometimes it makes no sense at all. But I promise you we'll get through this. We always pull through adversity, don't we, in the end? Let's get ready, shall we, so you can look good for the funeral. You need to remain strong, Mum, when we say our goodbyes to Great-Aunt Betsy." My mother began to cry again, smudging the mascara I had painstakingly applied to her lashes. She was beginning to look like a raccoon, with dark swirls running down her face. She couldn't possibly go to the church looking like this. I was sure I had some waterproof mascara somewhere. I could use that on my mother, I thought, when I fixed up her makeup again. I knew it was important to look presentable at church. I'm glad to say I finally succeeded in my endeavours. I found some makeup I'd used in my slimmer days, when I went through a patch of actually doing synchronised swimming, which I find hard to believe now. That was when I was in the best shape of my life. I had never thrown the makeup away. I always believed that one day I might find it useful again, and it turns out I was right. I applied the smudge-proof, waterproof makeup to my mother's face, styling her short-cropped hazelnut layers with some curling tongs, and helping her to dress in a black number that I'd once worn when I was infinitely smaller in size. It seemed to hang on my mother like a large black sack, but an elasticated belt I owned pulled the look together very nicely, and even if I say so myself, I admired my handiwork. My mother looked great. I didn't want to go to my mother's house to go through her wardrobe while she was staying with us, so at that moment she was wearing all my clothes. But they were far too big for her. I, on the other hand, struggled to fit into my little black dress that I'd intended to wear for Great-Aunt Betsy's funeral. It seemed to be bursting at the seams when I put it on. Had I rarely put on so much weight recently? How was it possible to pack on so many extra pounds in such a short space of time? It wasn't even remotely funny. I had worn this dress 6 months prior, for Reverend Garland's funeral, and now I could barely fit into the damn thing. When I looked at my sorry reflection in the mirror, I really did look like an overstuffed sausage, squeezed into a tight black skin, with everything bulging out in the wrong places. And the buttons in the front of the dress were stretched to full capacity, as they threatened to pop off in any second. When Barlow came into the room and saw my dress, he cracked up laughing, humiliating me still further, making me feel incredibly self-conscious. "Don't laugh, it's not funny," I said, making a sad face. "I could fit into this dress for Reverend Garland's funeral, and look at me now." "I will admit you do look a sorry sight," my husband said tactlessly, not sparing my feelings for a single second. "You can't possibly wear that thing. You look utterly ridiculous. The dress is tight, and those buttons are going to pop off in any second." "Well, I'm not intending to wear it," I said defensively. "Good, I hope not. If you didn't eat so many chocolate bars, you might be able to fit into that dress. Your sweet tooth is the reason you keep putting on weight, like a bear preparing for hibernation." I rolled my eyes in annoyance, but I knew he was absolutely right. When my husband left the bedroom, I waged war on that dress. I ripped it off me. It tore in half. I threw it angrily at my wardrobe. It lay in a forlorn-looking puddle. Finally I settled for wearing a navy blue dress instead, with white buttons down the front. It was near enough to the black, I thought, and would have to do. I have to say, with a navy blue hat, along with a pair of black stiletto shoes, I looked pretty good, even if I do say so myself. My mother's whole body began to shake and quiver, rather like a quaking aspen tree, when I'd finally finished applying the makeup on her face. She barely acknowledged her reflection in the mirror, even though I'd done a sterling job in making her look reasonably presentable. But let's just say no amount of clever makeup could conceal the obvious puffiness around her eyes, no matter how much skillful foundation I applied. It was, of course, a losing battle, rather like my fight with my black dress earlier on, that had refused to fit. "I just don't understand, Rose, how all these horrible things could happen to us," my mother cried. "It's too awful, just too awful." "I know, Mum," I said sympathetically, giving her a reassuring nudge. "It's not fair." My mother barely heard my words, and continued almost as if she was talking to herself rather than me. She laid out her feelings for all to see, like the pieces of a puzzle game on a table that she was trying to figure out, that she found far too complicated to understand or make any sense of. "I lost my mother in that car accident 5 years ago, Rose. And now her sister Betsy is tragically killed like this. They don't even know if your great-aunt Betsy was mauled by a bear or not. How can they not know something like that? How can they not know what happened to her? These people are supposed to be professional. They're supposed to decipher the things that are going on. They're supposed to be able to read between the lines, are they not? The medical examiner can't even determine what killed poor Aunt Betsy. How can they not know? I mean, she's a professional, is she not? She should figure these things out, shouldn't she?" "Not always, Mum. You can't be angry with the medical examiner. She's tried to do her job to the best of her ability. Sometimes they can't always establish what causes the person's death. It happens a lot, you know. It's not that unusual." "The medical examiner told me that it could have been a bear, given how scratched up your great-aunt Betsy was. But she can't be sure about it. But she says it was some kind of wild animal, with sharp claws and a very mean bite, whatever that's supposed to mean. I still believe a professional should know what killed Aunt Betsy. To think of how she was found, it just doesn't bear thinking about, does it?" "Mum, these things happen. This is Colorado. There have been reports of a rogue mountain lion wandering around the place, haven't they? Remember what Mrs. Hodge had to say about the matter?" "What did Mrs. Hodge say?" asked my mother, her red eyes fixing on me, as if I was telling her some new information that she'd never heard of before. "Oh, I thought you knew. 3 weeks ago Mrs. Hodge woke up to see a mountain lion on her porch with 3 beautiful, adorable lion cubs. Think about it, Mum. If Aunt Betsy encountered this mother lion with her cubs, the animal might have charged her, killed her even, to protect her younglings. It happens all the time with wild animals. Let's not kid. Great big chunks of flesh had been taken out of Great-Aunt Betsy's body, as if something had been eating her flesh. The only odd thing, of course, is you'd have thought a mountain lion and her cubs would have devoured her entire body, and maybe left a few scraps behind for the coyotes to enjoy. I'm sorry to be so graphic, Mum. But what about her internal organs? Littered all over the wood grove. Goodness gracious me. And what about the angle of her head when it was found? It was twisted and contorted. And the eyes had been taken out of their sockets. I mean, what would do that to her? That's not the work of a bear. I'm sorry, but it's not." "That's why they're in 2 minds as to whether a bear killed her or not, Mum. Sometimes you just have to accept that sometimes you just don't know the answers. But we do know a wild animal was involved in her death. We know that. But what killed her is a mystery. Sometimes we have to accept that answers will never be found." So there we are. That is the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.